In this video, we'll be talking about gap filling and some basic cleanup techniques. But first, I'd like to talk about what can be done during the capture process to avoid gaps. First, and most important, is to be aware of the visibility of the markers. If you have actions where an actor covers a marker or is in a pose where it can't be seen by cameras, the marker cannot be tracked. It's best to try to do all of your actions near the center of the motion capture area, where the cameras have the best coverage. Be aware of your actor's actions, and plan accordingly. Having multiple actors in the space or large props that cover up markers will hurt your data quality. For more difficult actions, expanded marker sets may help. That won't be covered in this video. We need to fill the gaps in the marker's tracks so that the software can know where the skeleton is at all times. Often, when tracking is lost on a marker, the quality of the data is bad immediately before tracking is lost and immediately after tracking is regained. Because of that, it is a good idea to use the Trim Tails tools to delete data around the gaps. First, select all of the tracks by clicking on the first track, scrolling down, and control-clicking on the last track. Leaving the settings at the defaults shown here, click Trim on All to remove 3 frames before and after each gap. Keep in mind that the standard capture rate is 120 frames per second instead of a more common 24 frames per second. Next, we will fill small gaps. We can see what tracks have gaps in them by selecting the Gapped Markers filter in the timeline. We'd like to fill all of the very small tracking gaps at first, so we only need to deal with the more difficult, larger tracking gaps. We'll use cubic interpolation with the max gap size set to 10 frames, and then click Fill Everything. This fills all gaps of 10 frames or less. We can see what tracks still have gaps in them by selecting Gap Markers again to refresh the filter. The next step is to label any unlabeled markers where the software was unable to correctly determine what marker it was. For this, we will be using the labeling panel. This can be found under View, Labeling. Let's expand this out so we can see everything. The labeling panel shows one actor at a time. The 2 columns show each marker by which side of the body it belongs to. Centerline markers are shown in the left column. If the marker has a percentage value next to it, that means that the marker has data for that percentage of the time and the rest is missing. Unlabeled markers are shown in the right column. Under the labeling settings, we see a few options for different labeling ranges. These control what range is assigned when we reassign a label. All assigns the new label to all frames. Selected assigns the label to the range selected in the timeline. Spike looks for large movement spikes and fills outwards from the play cursor until it encounters a frame with movement larger than the max spike setting. Fragment assigns the label outwards from the play cursor until it encounters a gap larger than the max gap setting. We'll be using Spike, with the max spike turned down to 10 mm per frame. The first thing I'll look for is markers with large gaps in them. We're going to try to match up these unlabeled marker tracks to their corresponding gaps in other markers. As we scroll through, we can see there are a few that have fairly long segments, and others that are much shorter. We'll go through these until we can assign them all to their correct track, or delete them because they're an erroneous marker. Let's start with this really long, unlabeled 109 marker. I'm going to scrub to its point in the timeline and try to figure out what it is. I've turned on marker labels under the visual aid here, so I can see the marker's name. This appears to be the left toe tip on the mic actor. I can also make the skeleton transparent by clicking here to disable skeleton selection. It seems that the L-toe tip has been erroneously assigned to a marker near the ankle. Let's fix that. It can be helpful to switch to the graph view so we can see where the jumps are in the track. You can see that there's a large jump here, a gap, and then another large jump. This means that the marker is likely misassigned for that range. And that is the case. Let's label this unlabeled marker here as the L-toe tip. We're going to select L-toe tip in the labeling menu and enter Quick Label mode. and I'm going to click on L toe tip with spike selected. I can also use the D key to enter and exit this mode very quickly. We can see that fixed most of it, but there's still a small jump. I'm going to zoom in on the timeline, and this time use selection mode to unlabel the marker, because there is no correct data during this time. And it seems I missed a frame as well. I'm going to continue through, noting that again, this unlabeled marker appears, which is part of the L toe tip. Let's label that now. There's still some bad data that doesn't have a corresponding unlabeled marker. So again, we'll unlabel that. Continuing through the timeline, we continue to see this unlabeled marker pop up that is the L toe tip. I'll keep clicking on it in quick label mode to try to assign it correctly. It seems that there are other issues with the foot. Namely, the L ankle out is regularly labeled incorrectly as the L toe tip. Let's use quick label mode to fix that. We can see that there's a jump here where some of the data is incorrect. There also appears to be two erroneous markers that the system is solving for. We may need to decide which one we want to actually use as the ankle out. It seems that the one assigned in this frame range is incorrect. Let's select that and unlabel it. This is also the case here, that the channel is labeled incorrectly. Here, the L ankle out is replaced by the toe tip, so let's correctly label that as L ankle out. We just seem to have assigned it to too large of a frame range. I accidentally left it on selected instead of spike, so let's hit undo, change back to spike, and correct that error. Our spike may be set too high. This doesn't seem to be working, so I will change that down to 5. This is still not working. It's making the marker jump back where it shouldn't be. I seem to be able to fix it by reassigning L ankle out again once it swaps with the toe tip. Again, switching back to selected mode, I can assign the L ankle out to this section. And unassign the areas where the toe tip has bad data. This is a slow process, but it's important to getting good data. I'll now time-lapse through fixing some more of the data. Through the course of cleaning this data, many of the automatic tools were not doing what I expected. If this happens, it may just be faster to switch to manually selecting ranges and applying the labeling that way. I also made use of the Swap Fix panel in the Edit tools, which will swap two markers in a selected range of frames, which can be very useful. Now that I'm done assigning all of the unlabeled markers, it's time to fill in more gaps. For this, we can use the Fill Gaps tool with different modes other than cubic. For example, we have pattern-based and model-based. Model-based is especially useful when there are other markers on that particular body part. Model-based bases the filling off of the other markers on that part of the model. For example, here, the hip marker is missing, but the other three have very good data. So selecting this gapped area and selecting Fill Selected using Model-based generates data based on the other markers. And this looks very good. The other option is pattern-based, which will pattern the marker's movement based off of the movement of one other marker. I use this much less and tend to rely on model-based, which automatically selects which markers to base the movement off of. I will now go through the gaps in this one by one and attempt to fill them all in using either model-based or cubic, depending on the situation. You can select the previous frames of a gap or the next frames of a gap using Find Previous and Find Next. This helps to work quickly, filling gaps. The hotkeys are Shift A and A, and the hotkey to fill selected is S. In some cases, like with this L toe in marker, the model data is bad at this point in time, and I don't have any good options for filling in. I can go into the graph editor, select the pencil tool, and simply draw in a new F-curve. This attempts to interpolate and does a decent job. Later, we'll use the smooth tools to clean up some of this mess. Now there are no gapped markers, only extraneous, unlabeled markers left. At this point, play through your animation and check for any more glitching, popping, or other oddities. There's one last step in the marker cleanup phase, and that's smoothing the tracks. Oftentimes, the markers will jitter significantly when tracking is bad. We can remove that by smoothing all tracks. The filter cutoff frequency controls how much smoothing is applied. Tracks that vibrate faster than that frequency are smoothed. I've found that 10 is a good default, but lower numbers will be more aggressive. we're going to click Smooth All Tracks. And the result should be smoother marker movement. The jitter seems to be entirely gone. We're done with the cleanup section. In the next video, I'll show you how to export your data.